Hello and welcome to EarthBeat. My name is Jesse Remedios, staff writer with NCR and EarthBeat, and I'm joined here today by Joan Rosenhauer, Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Service USA. Joan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So tomorrow, June 20th, is World Refugee Day, which is meant to honor the strength and courage of people displaced by conflict or persecution. As the Executive Director of JRS USA, Joan is one of the country's leading advocates on behalf of refugees. And we at EarthBeat wanted to talk to her in the lead up to World Refugee Day to learn more about how climate change is impacting the lives of refugees around the world. So Joan, why don't we start with some basic terminology? First question is, what is a climate refugee?
Well, the term climate refugee is definitely used, but it actually doesn't have a technical definition. It does not exist in international law. And what that means is, so the assumption is it's someone who is displaced because of climate events. But again, it doesn't have any status in international law, and that means that people who are displaced because of climate impacts don't have any protections under international law. This despite the fact that there are some estimates that suggest that 25 people every minute are displaced due to severe weather events such as floods and storms and droughts and things like that.
What's the difference then between a climate refugee and a climate migrant?
Well, it's really similar to the difference between a migrant and a refugee, and there are several terms that are worth discussing. So migrant is used to describe people who are on the move for any number of different reasons, some forcibly and some not. So it's a very broad term. Refugee gets you into the focus on forcibly displaced people. And it's interesting that just yesterday, the UN released its latest data on forcibly displaced people and indicated that 79.5 million people are forcibly displaced around the world. And that's an increase, a net increase, so every year some people get returned home or they get resettled or whatever, but it's a net increase in 2019, covering 2019, of nearly 9 million people who were forced to flee their home and are still displaced around the world. A refugee is someone who has fled their home and is in they've crossed an international border and they have fled their home owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or because of a political opinion. Sometimes in some contexts, in some agreements, that definition extends to people fleeing events seriously disturbing public order was the language used, but basically different kinds of violence and war and conflict and things. So when we talk about resettling refugees, we're talking about people who have gone through a formal process of being identified as a refugee, and that includes all kinds of vetting through the UN, through intelligence agencies across many countries and things. And the sad thing is for refugees, the US has really dropped its commitment. In 2016, there were nearly 85,000 refugees resettled in the US. In 2020, the maximum limit is 18,000. But I want to say something about two other terms. One of them is an asylum seeker, and that is someone who is seeking these international protections that exist for refugees, but they have already arrived at the country in which they're seeking the protection. So they may have done that, come into the country and then present themselves for asylum, or they may present themselves at a border crossing. And then finally, there's a term that is getting a lot of attention these days because it's a very broad challenge, which is internally displaced people. And those are people who have been forced to flee their homes, but they never cross an international border. And yet we know from what we see on the news that they are just as desperate. They're often in makeshift camps, responding to terrible circumstances, and yet they don't really get captured when you talk about a refugee.
Thanks so much. That's super helpful. So I guess the next question then is, what are some examples of how climate and climate change have displaced people then, whether they be refugees, internally displaced people, migrants? What are examples of that?
Well, there are two key types of events that cause people to flee. One is the sudden onset climate event that we often see people displaced due to extreme weather events such as cyclones or tsunamis or droughts or things like that. And the challenge is, this happens all over the world, but the challenge is in the poorest nations, for the poorest people, it's often very difficult for them to go back. It's not like they're displaced for a week and then they just go back. Once they've lost everything, they're stuck wherever they end up just to get out of the greatest challenge. And studies show that we are seeing more and more severe weather events as a result of climate change. In fact, the UN has indicated that every year, over and above the 79 million people or nearly 80 million people I mentioned before who are forcibly displaced, in addition, there's another 21.5 million people around the world who flee their homes because of a sudden onset weather event. And again, they are not covered by international protections. And they would be citizens in their own country if they're an IDP, but they still have lost everything and often really struggle. The other type of kind of impact the climate has on people that forces them to flee their homes is the slow onset climate event, which would be rising average temperatures that lead to land no longer being fertile, or rising sea levels that lead to coastal erosion. We see examples of this in Central America, where farmers can no longer grow the crops they used to grow because of consistently rising temperatures that they're experiencing. Another example would be sea level rise. They say that that is happening at a rate of about 12 millimeters per year in the Western Pacific, and already that has submerged 8 islands. And there are projections that by 2100, 48 islands in the Western Pacific will be lost due to, or I guess around the world, will be lost due to the rising sea levels. And clearly those are all people who are going to have to leave their homes and find a home somewhere else. And the last thing I'd say is that we also recognize climate as what the UN General Secretary has called a threat multiplier. So often it plays a role in other kinds of crises that then lead people to be forcibly displaced. So for example, there was a 5-year drought in Syria before the war broke out, and that contributed to some of the dynamics there and that led to the strife there. There's a similar situation in South Sudan where there's a civil war going on. So this idea that climate kind of accelerates other drivers of forcible displacement is, a very much recognized phenomenon.
Great, thank you so much. Another crisis that we're, of course, living through right now is COVID-19. So I'm wondering what has been the impact of COVID-19 and coronavirus on climate refugees and also just refugees more broadly?
Sure. Well, sadly, violence and persecution don't stop for a pandemic. So the impact is really terrible on refugees, on people who are fleeing because of the fear of violence and persecution and things like that, because around the world, over 160 countries have closed their borders, including the US. That means that these refugees have no access to the protection that they need. And that is certainly the case in the US over time in the last few months. And since the pandemic broke out, our asylum policies and other types of programs and protections have been shut down significantly. But I'll say one other thing about how the pandemic is affecting refugees, which is that they are often in the most crowded, desperate situations, and the disease, we're watching it make its way around the world. So we see it growing now in Latin America. There are projections that in Africa, it's going to see its peak between mid-July and mid-October. And I saw a report that I think in the last 18 days, the number of cases in Africa doubled. So we can see that it's following that same pattern of accelerating the incidence. More and more rapid clean water to wash their hands. Often in these camps, it's a long haul to try to get access to water, and very little access to health care, and very limited health care. So they protect themselves. So there's more hand washing stations. So there's isolation buildings for people who contract the disease, and just a wide variety of things. We use camp radios to do the education on COVID so that people can still learn.
Wow. And what about climate change? What has been the impact of climate change on current refugees who have been displaced by persecution or conflicts?
Well, I think, as I've said, it is clearly recognized. It is clearly recognized as a factor, a threat multiplier in these situations. So the intersection between climate change and its impact on people, and forcible displacement, and other factors of violence and war and things like that is clearly recognized. And what happens then is that people are just beaten down by repeated crises. I remember talking to a colleague of mine in Zimbabwe after Cyclone Idai, and he said basically, imagine having fled your home after violence, was imminent for you, that it threatened your life. You're grabbing your kids, you're fleeing, you're trying to settle in a whole new place with almost no resources. You're living in a strange place with a mud hut, and then having it all flattened by a storm, and have that storm destroy the few possessions you've collected, since you've had to leave everything behind, and you've lost everything already once and now twice. So it's those kinds of experiences where we see that climate change really multiplies the challenges that refugees face.
Yeah, so then I guess looking towards the future, then as someone who works really closely on this topic, what do you think going forward? How do you expect climate change to continue impacting the lives of refugees? Do you see the situation changing in some way, or is it kind of similar along those same lines that you were talking about?
I'm clearly very concerned about the long-term impact, because we're just not taking climate change seriously enough, and we're not addressing it in a serious enough way to really put a halt to it, and therefore the impact is going to continue. The UN estimates that by 2050, up to 250 million people will be displaced by climate change impacts, such as rising sea levels and floods and famine and droughts and things like that. So that's a huge number. We currently have 79.5 million people displaced. They're talking 250 million people by 2050. So it's clearly going to be a huge challenge, and it's going to very much impact internally displaced people. Not everybody will cross a border, and so we have to help countries prepare to help their people, and we have to help the people who are in that situation now, and then building toward helping others as this happens, so that certainly they can mitigate their impact, though in many cases their impact is minimal, but also that they can adapt as they need to. And so that's a real focus for us. But I think for JRS USA, we also want to educate people, so that as a culture globally, we are going to attend more, and those who have the biggest impact also make the biggest difference in slowing changes to our climate.
That's great. That leads perfectly into the next question. In terms of priorities, I guess you just mentioned education, but from a humanitarian standpoint, what is JRS's biggest concerns in regards to climate change, and what initiatives, I guess, are you guys doing to try to address those concerns?
Well, the first thing I would say is we need to do a lot more, and we are, and we need to really do an assessment of what we can do where, to make sure that we're doing as much as we can. But yes, so one thing would be education for people all over the world, people in the countries where we serve. We serve in more than 50 countries around the world, so that they are aware of what they can expect in terms of climate events, and how they can prepare. Preparedness is important. Adaptation is important when they're finding that there's a change in weather patterns, higher temperatures, things like that. And then also to respond when the worst happens and people are displaced. One of the things that we focus on is education for refugees and also lively. They are in a high risk area as it relates to climate events. So looking at all of those things, and we do other kinds of work like reconciliation work, because when people flee, they often find themselves in.
Oh, you back?
Yes.
Sorry. I think the last thing I heard was
What do we do about this? I mean, what's that?
I think the last thing I heard was when people flee, and you were talking about reconciliation work, I think.
Oh yeah. Okay. Okay. When people flee, they're often both in the refugee or displaced person setting with people who are different from themselves, and then the host community is often already impoverished, and so the struggle of those relationships is important, and so we want to help equip people to adapt across the board, the host community and the refugees or IDPs to be able to adapt and work together and live in peace. And the final thing is healthcare, because all people who flee their home force have been through some kind of trauma. And if that is addressed, it will haunt them the rest of, and that's true of adults, and it haunts them their whole lives, but children in particular, if they're not helped to address this, definitely pay the price later in their lives. So we want to make sure that we address all of that, so that as people are forced to flee their homes due to climate change, they're best equipped to rebuild their lives and lead a happy life.
Great, thank you so much. And then the last question is that I saw that JRS signed on to the NGO Climate Compact. I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what that is and why you guys signed on.
Sure. So it is a compact initiated by an organization called Interaction, which is an association of many international non-governmental organizations in the U.S. And many operate other places, but have a connection to the U.S. and to D.C. and things. And the compact was signed by more than 80 of their members, and its purpose is to really make a collective statement about the direction that we all need to go over the next 2 years to address climate change, and to codify commitments in several key areas in our organization. So one is our education and advocacy, public awareness building, things like that. Another is our programming around the world, cross-sectorally, making sure that we're attentive to climate change in all of our programs. Our international operations at our headquarters and in our field offices and things like that, making sure that we look at how we're attentive to protecting the environment and all the things that we do, things like travel and various things. And then finally, learning for ourselves, that we're constantly learning and keeping each other aware so that we can do the most we can. And JRS signed on because of church teaching about care for creation and Laudato Si and everything that the Holy Father has said about the importance of caring for the environment. But also as a Jesuit organization, we signed on because of the Universal Apostolic Principles, the fourth of which is caring for God's creation. And so for us, this is a part of our mission, both its roots in Catholic teaching and Jesuit priorities, and then also because of just the general commitment to care for the most vulnerable. And they will be impacted in very severe ways by climate change.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joan, for taking the time. We really appreciate it, and best of luck with that initiative and all the great work that you guys do at JRS.
Thank you, Jesse. And I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties, but I hope you can make some use of it.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. Thanks so much. All right, I'm gonna stop it.
Okay.